course. Welcome to week 12 and the final lecture for this course. The final one of 4 that we did that should give you a way of thinking about design in a much more interesting and critical way. And this one we will look at the notion of ethics and design, which is quite separate from design ethics, and we'll get to that as time goes on. In this lecture, we will hope to get through all of this today. The 3 areas of ethics: meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And then we'll look at particular design codes of practice. And then we'll look at particular designers and their codes of practice and how that all connects up and how that should inform you. Ethics. Ethics is something that we all kind of know. In the back of our heads, a lot of other ideas come together when we think about ethics. We think about words like good. We think of words like right, correct. We think about morality. We think about theology. We think about philosophy. Ethics is quite simply an inquiry into how we ought to act. Right? What you ought to act, what you should be doing. And it's not a means to an end. The action becomes an end to itself. Some of the key words you can use is ought to, obligation, duty, right and wrong. Right? Good and bad. Those are the kind of words we use when we talk about ethics. But ethics primarily is a way of understanding what you ought to be doing, what you should do. One of the key things and important about ethics, as opposed to just sort of having a chit-chat with your friends, which is slightly less structured, is that ethics has to be about systemizing, defending, and recommending concepts. You actually have to sit down and think about how you would go about creating a belief system or an ethical framework that will be consistent and applicable to yourself or to others in a much more cohesive way than in an ad hoc way. You have to be able to defend your position. Why is it that you've taken that position? And if you can defend your position, you can then put forward your position to other people as a recommendation of what will constitute right or wrong behavior. So ethics does quite a lot of different things. It's not as simple as I reckon, I believe, and then case by case. It's a bit more complicated than that. Ethics in some way is one of the oldest branches of philosophy. We have been thinking about what is ethical behavior, what ethics itself means, and where it can be applied for the longest time. So the 3 schools of ethics that we will look at today are meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. And we'll start with meta-ethics. Meta, as the word just means before, so this is the ethics before the notion of right and wrong. So meta-ethics is a study of the origins and meanings of ethics. It is understanding why it exists and why it matters. Meta-ethics isn't about deciding what's right and wrong. Meta-ethics is about questioning what constitutes notions of right. How do we go about thinking about what is right? So it doesn't really arrive at a judgment position. It stays more at a concept and slightly more abstract position. But it's very fundamental to understanding what ethics is. Meta-ethics is about studying its relationship with humanity and if and how that ethics would exist independently of human beings. Now, we tend to think ethics is inscribed into us, but as time has gone on, we have now put ethics into other situations, such as animals, and that raises the question of whether ethics matters in a situation or not. Ethics, meta-ethics is ethics in the mind of the individual as a basis of action. All right? So we're not looking at the action itself, we're looking at what the constructs in the head, in the mind, in the brain that exists that then would govern or push us to certain types of action. So meta-ethics is a more abstracted version of thinking about ethics. Meta-ethics is an attempt to understand metaphysical, epistemological, semantic, psychological presuppositions and commitments of moral thought, talk, and practice. A lot of big words there, so let's just have a think quickly. Metaphysical is before the being. So metaphysical is a branch of philosophy that really focuses on asking the questions about being, existence in itself. Right? Epistemological means study of knowledge. Right? So we've spoken in the previous lectures about discourses. So epistemological is about knowledge systems. Semantic, kind of obvious, we've done this a lot, is the issue of meaning. Psychological is about what's happening within the person itself. Presuppositions and commitment means the ideas that we assume exist, upon which we can then engage in moral thought, talk, or practice. So metaethics looks at a lot of complicated fields and tries to develop a way of thinking about the constitution of ethics. Metaethics explores the connection between values, reasons for actions, and human motivations, asking how is that moral standards might provide us with reasons to do or refrain from doing. So it's really not asking you to decide what is wrong, what is right, what is bad, what is good, but it's asking you to think about how you would go about constituting that given the different things that are going on, such that they would be basis of action, such that they would be basis of motivation. All right? And then as time goes on, we then can do something with that once we have had those discussions to put some action into that space. So metaphysics starts right at the beginning, so some call it second order, where we explore the foundations and scope of moral values, properties, and words. So whereas the normative ethics and applied ethics focuses on what is moral, metaethics will question the notion of morality itself. So in some ways, this is a discussion that you need to have before you can even talk about right or wrong. Before you can talk about actions, you need to talk about what will constitute the very notion of morality and what that would mean and where it's coming from. So some simple questions that can help us think about metaethics. What are you doing when you use the words like good and bad, good and right? So when you say to someone, this is a good thing, what are you actually doing? What are the things going on that make you think about the very notion of good? What exactly is the moral value? Where does it come from? What's its foundation? What's its source? So anytime you make a call on an object or on a value, we sort of assume that that value stands for itself. But we know, especially if you move from culture to culture and context to context, that notions and words are not fixed. So what might constitute a good action in one space might not constitute a good action in another space. So it gets you to really think, where is that actually just coming from? And then, importantly, are some things right for everyone in all situations? Now, is there an absolutist way of thinking about ethics? Is that a valid way of thinking? Or ethics always relative? They always change. So answering those questions is talking about metaphysics, where you're not judging anyone's action, but you're really thinking about what motivates, what underpins your understanding of when you make the value analysis or you decide when something sits on one fence or the other. So metaethics sits there. Normative ethics, and we've come across the word norm several times now. We talked about normative behaviors, normative language, normative discourse. And normative generally means trying to make a way of thinking that's dominant and considered the accepted way of doing things. So normative ethics, unlike metaethics, focuses on the measure or the standards of rightness and wrongness of action. While metaphysics focuses on the notion of good, normative ethics focuses on what is good action. So you're no longer debating notions of good and correct and right and wrong, but you're starting to look at the action itself. Now, this means that you already have an idea or an end in mind. Behavior such as this would constitute good. So you're starting to judge that action and how good it is or how wrong it is. Normative ethics focuses on whether it's correct or not to hold a particular belief. So here, unlike meta-ethics, which really focuses on understanding what constitutes that notion, here you're saying, well, let's look at the action itself. And let's unpack that action. Is that action going to be good, or is that action going to be bad? Eventually, over time, normative ethics sets norms or creates standards for behavior. So that's what normative ethics is really useful for. As time goes on, we have a sense of where we stand, what kind of ethical positions are accepted, and what's not accepted. If a child is drowning in a pond, what are you supposed to do? How if a child is drowning in a pond, but you're wearing very expensive shoes? How if the child is drowning in the pond, but you have very nice clothes on? Right? Normative ethics sets the position out quite clearly as it creates a value system within the scenario that governs our behavior, where human life is given the highest amount of value. All right? That's a form of normative ethics. So with normative ethics, it isn't concerned with moral concepts or methods, but it's asking the substantive moral questions. So it's asking you to decide what moral principles by which all moral agents ought to be guided for morally right action, so that you know what the answer to the question is supposed to be. So you're not questioning the very nature of good or bad, but you're asking yourself, when the child is drowning, what am I supposed to do? Normative ethics says you're supposed to jump in. If you have nice shoes, normative ethics says the child's life is more important, and so on and so forth. It's fairly well laid out, it's fairly clear. And what normative ethics can be really useful for is in resolving disagreements. And that's one of the key usefulness of ethics. It's about creating an expected end such that we can resolve any debates or disputes that might arise. One of the golden rules, or sort of simplistic way of thinking about normative ethics, is we should do to others what we would want others to do to us. So normative ethics has an interesting space there, where you are supposed to be, in a way, the mirror of the world. So you would behave in a way you expect other people to behave. So if you are walking down the street and you haven't been stabbed, then you should assume that you shouldn't walk around the street and stab people either, right? You sort of end up with that position and you're all happy not stabbing each other. You effectively have a moral contract with the other, with society, with your buddies as you walk down the street. The problem with normative ethics is there's only one criteria for moral conduct upon which all action is judged. So in normative ethics, more often than not, you end up with one dominant way of thinking or a set of dominant ways of thinking. And going by that logic, it determines that everybody should be judged in that similar way, which can be problematic. Normative ethics offers an overarching framework for moral action, which then can end up governing everyone who's supposed to be engaging in that space. So that all sounds good, sounds reasonable, but it's not always workable because the norm in itself can be problematic and needs to be challenged and reinforced or reconfigured on a regular basis. Within normative ethics, I don't spend too much time on this bit. Within normative ethics, we divide it up into a further 3 forms of ethics. I'm just going to go to them quickly. One of them is virtue ethics. This is the oldest form of thinking. This one's interesting because so much of what we do in education is still wound up or wrapped up in this kind of way of thinking, where it focuses not on judging you on your actions alone, in fact focusing a lot more on what constitutes good character. So it doesn't focus on the action. So you might lie, but you're a good person, so you've lied for a good reason. It's not judging the action alone. It's judging what constitutes a particular character. So it focuses on the being rather than the doing. This is one of the oldest, so you have Plato and Aristotle writing about virtue ethics. And the idea is that having virtue, having that character thing, trait, would mean you're more likely to act and continue to act in virtuous ways. And that is what you want to do. So this is where you get the classic thing about children need to be trained to behave in a virtuous way so they learn the right values. And as adults, our duty is to continue to ensure that kids learn a virtuous behavior. So it becomes naturalized and normative for them to behave in that way so that they're not naughty. The other one is duty ethics or deontological ethics. Here we look at the notion of duty itself, where you have certain obligations. You're supposed to behave in a particular way due to the duty, and your morality is measured by your adherence to that duty. Which means you might have to do something that is not right, but if it's your duty to do so, you're supposed to do so. In the army, if you're issued an order, you're supposed to comply with the order. If it's an unlawful order, you're supposed to comply with the order and then complain about it. But you're not allowed to not comply with an order. The notion of obligation is paramount over whether what you think is right or wrong. So you have a series of behaviors that you're supposed to adhere to, and you follow them in a very absolute way. At no point you should be able to, should be desirous of compromise. So the emphasis here is a lot more on your action. The action is more important than the consequences of the action. Virtue here is irrelevant. It doesn't fall into this area. So Thomas Jefferson, and coming from John Locke, they talk about the notion of natural rights, our human rights. That's a form of duty ethics, right? Human rights are supposed to be an obligation and a duty. So if you look at something like freedom of speech, there is an idea within freedom of speech that we have a duty to the very notion of that you're allowed to speak, such that even if their speech is hurtful, that's not really important. In fact, we valorize people like Voltaire, who said, and I paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quote, I don't agree with what you're saying, but I defend your right to say it. So in a lot of liberal democratic societies like ours, you see things like standing up for things like the last temptation of Christ or the satanic verses, because we put a greater value on performance of duty in these terms, in terms of freedom of speech, than we do to the consequences of the action, which have resulted in deaths of people in different countries, right? So those are something that falls within that situation. We don't think of it very often, but to us it's always very clear. Jefferson says, and I think this is important, and that's why the Bill of Rights, the American Bill of Rights, is fascinating. Natural rights are natural. It means we have them. We cannot not have them. They're universal. They apply to all of us. They're equal. They apply to all of us equally. And they're inalienable, which means I cannot choose not to have that. That's really important. Finally, Immanuel Kant, he talks about a notion of categorical imperative, where the action and the duty has an authority that's irrespective of what you want. You're supposed to do something regardless of what you want. So a simplification of that idea is you're supposed to be the best student in the class, whether you want to go out and have fun or not. You have a duty to maximize your potential as a human being because it's for the benefit of society. So notions of fun are out. So the categorical imperative is that kind of idea that you have to have this sort of almost, pathological obsession with your duty. Finally, the teleological ethics, consequentialist ethics. This one's in a way easier to understand. Here is where we judge the consequences of the action as opposed to the action itself. So whereas in a deontological ethics, you focus on the action over the consequences, here you say, well, we look at the consequences itself. So you might have to lie, you might have to be untrue, but if the consequence of that unethical action from the duty perspective is positive, is ethical, then that's okay. So what they ask us to do almost as a mathematical thing where you do a pros and cons column, and if there's more pros than cons, then you do that action. If there's more cons than pros, you don't do that action. So you focus on doing the action that has greater positive consequences than not. And that's how you judge morality. So this is something that we do a lot in our day-to-day life. We judge our actions, usually doing a very quick calculation of whether we think lying at this point in time will do more good or bad. So you should be already in your everyday practice and the way you deal with things in life, see how you fall into those spaces. So in the metaphysical space, sorry, not metaphysical, meta-ethical space, that's where you're actually talking about what your values mean and where they sit and where they stand, what definitions they are in that space. And then within the normative ethics, I think for us on a day-to-day basis, we don't really talk about virtue in that way very much, although it's starting to make a comeback. We talk more about duty ethics or deontological ethics, where when you stand up for things like freedom of speech, or you stand up for things like equality, human rights, you stand up for anti-sex trafficking and things like that, it's because you're taking a position that there are certain values that are absolute and cannot be compromised. But we also, at the same time, do the other thing where we judge our actions or the actions of people around us by looking at the consequences of the action. So even though they might be duty-bound to behave in a particular way, we give them a pass or we prefer them to take certain action, which is more using the consequentialist way of thinking. So this should give you an interesting way of just starting to divvy up your own little ways of being and doing things into those two schools. Finally, we come to applied ethics. And applied ethics is the one that is a bit more interesting in some ways. So normative ethics focuses on what people should believe to be right and wrong, and meta-ethics focuses on the nature of moral statements. Applied ethics is when you apply normative ethics to real situations that require a moral judgment. So a way to think about it in some ways is to sort of step back and think, how does the problem move? All right? And this is sort of a simple way of thinking about it, and there are flaws in this reasoning, but I think it's a useful way as an entry into thinking about the issue. With normative ethics, you have a position, and the action determines, and the action then determines the outcome. You already have a place you're taking normatively. This is ethical, whether it's duty or consequentialist. This is an ethical way. Hence, if this action were to happen, I would behave in that way. What applied ethics is trying to do is say, this is a situation that's happening. And it's usually a very complex situation where you have people who are in disagreement, who are coming from different normative positions, who have competing interests. So you then have to take those competing interests from different normative positions, apply it to the practical situation in an organized and structured, systemized way to then provide an outcome. So applied ethics, as it says there, is a philosophical examination through the application of normative ethics to practical situations that require moral judgment. So that's the key thing. You have a situation, you have people with different normative positions who have a different desire for an outcome. And you have to apply a methodology to extract the right answer, to provide the moral judgment. So it's trying to do something different. So it's not normative ethics. You have to be very clear. Normative ethics, we all have different ethics, right? I might have a different ethical framework than you. Within my judgment of of something that's happened or situation would differ from your judgment of the situation because we have different normative positions. But when we both have to exist and work in the same situation and dealing with the same problem and we are opposed to each other, we still need an outcome. And applied ethics is the process of resolving the dispute to give an outcome that is in effect a moral judgment. Applied ethics resolves the stalemate in normative ethics between conflicting theories that prevents us from using a single decisive procedure for determining the morality of a specific issue, right? So two competing interests, two different or three different, how many it is, normative positions are struggling over one situation. You come in and solve the problem. What you normally do is you take, and this is you see this in political process, you take a bunch of different representations from people from different positions, and then you try to see where the weight of evidence lies. And this is one of the harder things to work out. So applied ethics also exist around us in many interesting ways. Notions of animal rights or animal ethics, and our Australian philosopher Peter Singer is one of the leaders in this. It's a fairly new field, but it's trying to examine the ethics that we extend out to animals. We take it for granted that we are supposed to eat them, and we take it for granted that unfortunately some of them will have to be killed in various processes. So we make ethical decisions on where we stand and what kind of damage we're willing to do. Even if you're a vegetarian, you're involved in animal slaughter, given harvesting in itself kills thousands of animals. There's a lot of complexity there that needs to be unpacked. But you would see a situation where you might have between a vegetarian, a vegan, and an omnivore, and how they will be looking to resolve a particular situation. And that's where applied ethics will come in from different normative positions. Bioethics is another one. And as medical science progresses, it becomes more and more complicated. It's the ethics of medicine, medical procedures. How do we go about doing these things? Social ethics, on how society is governed. What are the assumptions we build into this, and where does the ethical positions sit within that? And so on and so forth. So there's environmental ethics, there's technological ethics. Technological ethics, one of the more interesting fields of technological ethics, is looking at human computer interfacing, where computers are replicating more and more human behavior, particularly through intelligent artificial intelligence. And what would that mean for us as time goes on, right? And now we'll come to what interests us, which is business/professional ethics. And I'll explain to you why I think the professional ethics in this field still ends up in the business arena. So we'll look at two things in the next part, which is design code of ethics, code of practice, and designer's code of practice. Now some people dispute what a code of practice is versus an ethical framework. But for us, as practitioners, you've got to think about the code of practice as the closest to your discipline's ethical framework. So what are professional ethics? Usually manifested as industry codes of practice. A lot of industries have them. I think most industries have them. I know design industry has them. The journalists definitely have them. The PR people have them. So builders will have them, and so on and so forth. What's the primary objective for most of these professional ethics? Is to prevent the exploitation of the client as well as preserve the integrity of the profession. This is an important thing that we'll come back to as we go on, but it's focusing on making sure that the dignity of your discipline and your profession, of whom you and your fellow travelers are representatives of, so you are very much involved in preserving the name, the good name of communication design in Melbourne and Australia at large, as well as making sure you don't do over the clients, because that's a very good way of ruining the integrity of your profession. Usually this is done by defining a standard of conduct, code of conduct, which members are expected to follow. And this codified set of behaviors helps the client to go, all right, I know if I work with a designer who's a signed up member of AGDA, this is their code of practice, I can live with that. You know, because you're assuming that that person who signed up will deal with that. The code of practice is about helping professionals deal with difficult issues and giving you a sense of what will be an ethical behavior in that situation. Now, as we will go through, you'll realize that the AGDA Code of Conduct doesn't actually do that. The AGDA Code of Conduct is, I think, a really immature, problematic document. I don't really want to say that, but it is, you know, there's an approach to regulation that uses a light touch approach, which is about minimizing what you prescribe. But the problem with that is you're not actually providing guidance to your members as to what they would do. Neither is AGDA dispute resolution set up, which is another issue. But anyway, that's a discussion for another time. So according to the Australian government, this is what a code of conduct is supposed to do. It's supposed to guidelines for fair dealing between you and your customers, and understanding that what you are doing and what your customers are doing and usually applies to the industry. But importantly, they can be mandatory and they can be voluntary. What does that mean? Mandatory means it's usually a statutory legislation and it's enforced. So with the architects, you have to be part of the industry body, because the industry body certifies what you do. With certain business areas, accountancy, right? These are accrediting bodies. If you don't have the accreditation, you cannot practice. Law is another one. You have to have passed and been invited to the bar. If not, you're not allowed to practice. So that becomes mandatory, which means that if there's a dispute, it can be resolved, and there's very clear legal remedies and usually precedents that guide where you end up. So those are usually more popular. Then there's a voluntary, which falls under self-regulation, which is extremely problematic from a variety of perspectives, because usually when you're regulating yourself, you tend to be very forgiving, right? If you break, so the AGDA Code of Conduct, not to pick on AGDA, but that's just relevant for us. The AGDA Code of Conduct is voluntary and is self-regulation, which means if you don't follow it, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, they might kick you out. I don't know if that's ever happened. But beyond that, nothing will happen to you. So you can pretty much do what you want to do. And that can be problematic in itself. And that's the Australian government. So let's look at AGDA. You all know what AGDA is? Yep, Australian Graphic Design Association. If you don't know what it is, jump on their website, have a look, because they've got quite a lot of interesting resources. But what you might find useful is they have definitions for the different jobs that you're doing. A lot of people don't understand that list of jobs has been codified in quite a clear, straightforward way. So on their website, you'll find what is a graphic designer, what is a communication designer, and all the different grades that you can end up working in an office and so on and so forth. But anyway, we'll look at their code of ethics. So they start off with, I'm not a big fan of informal writing in a code of ethics, because I think you got to send a strong signal. So this is just my personal thing, but that's okay. They go on by saying, what use is a code of conduct, code of ethics to a graphic designer or related professional? Isn't it just another boring slab of legalese, more pompous than pertinent? We hope not, exclamation mark. And I have to tell you, when I read that, immediately it just makes me frustrated. Because you think it is not about being pompous. It's about being clear. It's about setting standards. And if the language has to be hard, then people need to grow up. But to hide behind this, we'll have a bigger discussion tomorrow about AGDA, and you'll hear what I think about it. We might get Russell Kerr involved if we can. I'm sure he'll have something to say. So anyway, the code of ethics is to establish what constitutes fair play. It is intended to provide protection for designers and clients from unethical practices and the havoc that can be caused by unwitting ignorance. So again, quite clear, it's about protecting the client and it's about protecting you. And as such, by protecting the relationship, it protects the industry in itself. And there's some interesting bits as we walk through later we'll look at where they talk about and they define what are different type of things you would promise a client. So you can read that. This one's an interesting one, and I think Bronwyn can talk to us more about it tomorrow, where they talk about powerful tool in dealing with destructive practices such as competitive free pitching, to which AGDA is unequivocally opposed. We'll talk more about it tomorrow. All right, so 2.1. 2.1 says the environment. Not much has been said yet, but we're already talking about environment. Okay, that's good. Members shall work in a manner so that as little harm, direct or indirect as possible, is caused to the natural environment. Good idea. I don't mind it. I think it's a good start. We always need to look at environment. But when you write a code of ethics like that, you need to provide people with a way of thinking or measuring what that would mean, but that's okay. Conflict of interest, professional conduct, design standards, and support of AGDA. So that's what you're supposed to do if you've signed up to AGDA. If you haven't signed up to AGDA, there's still an underlying message here that if you're a graphic designer in Australia, these are the kind of things you'd be expected to engage with or stand for. So we've gone from members' responsibility to the community, which is really on environment, focusing on yourself, conflict of interest, integrity, professional conduct, integrity, high standards of design and professional conduct supports the aims of AGDA industry. Client's best interest. So members' responsibility to the client. Again, you have talked about you must do stuff that's in the best interest of your clients with the limitation of professional obligation. So it's telling you obligation, taking a position on the type of rights it's supposed to have. Guidelines, conflict of interest, and confidentiality. So far, so good. All these things are quite useful to have. Members' responsibility to other designers. So I don't know how many of you were aware, but you have a responsibility to your fellow travelers, and they have a responsibility to you. The first of all, effectively, is don't work for free. Great piece of advice if you ask me. Because every time one of you works for free, you undermine everybody else around you. Because if I can get a design for free, what would I ever pay for it, right? That's the reality of the industry that especially, not to go off on a rant here, but with American-style internships coming into Australia, where you are being asked to work for 3 months, 6 months, some of you without even having to turn up at an office, long-term you're undermining the industry, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. Existing commissions, so again, sets are quite clear. Members shall not knowingly accept a commission to work on a project for which there's an existing designer. So which means if a client already has a designer and they come to you, you're not supposed to take them on. Bronwyn? Does that happen? So we can talk about that again. So plagiarism, breach of copyright. We'll come back to this tomorrow again for a case study we'll look at. Criticism of other designers' work. A member shall be fair in criticism of another designer's work. A member shall not belittle or denigrate the work or reputation of another designer. I love that one because I think that's good, but it says an assumption built in here. The assumption built in here is that the work is not that bad that you cannot denigrate it. If someone hands in a turd, you should be able to call it a turd. It's as simple as that. So built in the assumption in this code of ethics is that somehow all designers are extremely talented and good at their job, right? How if this work is against the environment, then are you allowed to denigrate it or belittle it? You see what I mean? So immediately it's created a conundrum where you have to resolve that ethical situation if it ever came about. More stuff about commission. So this is how you would go about presenting a commission, accepting a commission, how subcontracting works, and you can read this on their website. The fees they charge, something else about free pitching, then about discounts, how to work with other people, design competitions. This one's interesting. If you're an EGDA member, you're not actually allowed to take part in any competition if the terms of the competition aren't approved by EGDA, which will pretty much rule you out of most international competitions. So I'm not quite sure why this is there, but you know, why not? It's an interesting one. This is the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not have any gods before me." It's taking that kind of ground. All right. And then self-promotion and publicity and so on and so forth. So there is that code of conduct out there and code of ethics, as they call it, which is trying to do something quite useful and interesting, but perhaps it's not really well articulated. It's only a couple of pages long on the website. There's no print version I couldn't find. But it's like, 10 points. So you can't really articulate a strong position, and there's contradictions within that. So it's an ethical framework that's out there for you. If you had a problem and you went to your organizing body, industry body, say, I have a problem, I need guidance, their code of ethics would not be the document that helps you. And that is a problem. So let's look at another one, which is global, the AIGA. What does it stand for? International, Association of International. Anyway, whatever. They have a whole booklet on design, business, and ethics. And it's quite an interesting booklet. And I think it's worth having a look at. You can download it for free on their website because they lay out a really nice experience from beginning to end. I've only ripped out certain bits that we want to look at. And the two bits that are interesting here is they've separated the standards of professional practice from the business expectations. So they're actually quite clear. They define their work in quite clear ways. So if you look at the booklet, they even have a section on use of fonts, use of images. So they're really trying to help you understand your ethics and a code of practice from very particular positions. So they're not just sort of giving you nice big statements and hope we all get along. They're trying to do something much more interesting. So they talk about the designer's responsibility to clients, the designer's responsibility to other designers, publicity, fees, authorship. Authorship one's interesting because they talk about how you manage collaborations. So as an ethical framework, this is much more useful because it's giving me a lot more information, but also talking about things that I can use. So if I were going for a code of ethics or trying to understand my ethical responsibility as a graphic designer, communication designer, the AIGA code of practice would be much more useful. All right, so let's now talk about the designer's code of practice. So we'll go to Milton Glaser, who 2002, in an interview said that in the new AIGA's code of ethics, there's a significant amount of useful information and appropriate behavior towards clients and other designers, but not a word about a designer's relationship to the public. So that, I think, is a really telling thing coming from someone as well respected and as legendary as Milton Glaser. So go back to the EGDA's code of conduct. They talk about the environment. And it's a very throwaway line, 2.1 environment. But there's no talk about don't make ads for cigarettes, gambling, antisocial, or those kinds of, or you will not make predatory ads that are designed to make people, push people, nudge people to particular behaviors and so on. So it never talks about the designer, but it really just talks about the business person. So that's why I said earlier, when we talk about professional ethics and business ethics, I think when we look at these things, you can make an argument that they're more business ethics than they are professional ethics. The AIGA is better for professional ethics. The EGDA seems to be leaning more towards business ethics. So, and that's the important thing, what matters. Why does that matter? I believe that thinking about the consequences of your work is essential. Since we're specifically involved in the transmission of cultural ideas about value, we have to examine the meaning of what we're proposing. So I try to suggest that a designer's role is one in which we have to be at least conscious of the consequences of what we transmit to others. So Milton Glaser here is asking you to step back and not worry so much about those business professional ethics, but ask yourself, what are my ethical positions as a designer? What will I do and not do? And in week 9, we had some of your peers, your seniors and your peers, talking about those, and those are the kind of questions you were asking them. So it's really important to start exploring that and to get a stronger sense. So Glaser in 2002, as part of a speech to the AIGA conference, talked about the 10 things I have learned. And this is his own version of putting out kind of ethical positions that he has, things that he believes in. And you can read that. I've posted it on the assignment sheet, so you can read it there, right? You can only work for people that you like. If you have a choice, never have a job. These are less sort of prescriptive and legal-like. But they're really still ethical frameworks because he's asking you to interrogate what you do through thinking about these things, right? So less is not necessarily more. That's an interesting one to read. Style is not to be trusted. It's a really good one. Why does he say that? So you can read that more. But what's interesting is he's trying to think about talking to people and how he will put himself forward as the designer who's having that cultural exchange with the audience rather than worrying about it being mediated through the business. He also talks about another one. This is also on the assignment sheet. You can read it. The 12 Steps to Hell. It's clear that in the profession of graphic design, the question of misrepresenting the truth almost arises almost immediately, and what you can do and do not. So he came up with this 12 steps of graphic designer hell, road to hell. And he says, so it's a podcast that he has with Debbie Millman. He talks about the fact that he's taken these steps. So he starts off by putting out stuff that he's done, and he thinks it gets worse and worse. Design a package to make it look bigger on the shelf. It says that's design 101. Everybody does it, right? Designing an ad for a slow, boring film to make it seem like a light-hearted comedy. And he goes on, designing a medal using steel from the World Trade Center to be sold as a profit-making souvenir of 9/11, and so on and so on. So this is 12 steps. So what's useful with Milton, what Milton Glaser has done here is he's sort of given us the two sides of a coin. On one side, with the 10 things I've learned, he talks about ethics in the sort of that positive sense. This is what you should do. This is what you do. And the other one, he tries to talk about ethics of examples of stuff you shouldn't be doing. So he looks at it from a very personal position, trying to establish a sense of what he considers moral, what he considers right, what he considers correct. Right? And design has a long history of doing that. 1964, I think 1964. 1964, a bunch of leading designers, and you can read the names here, signed a manifesto called The First Things First. Have you heard of this? No? All right, it's definitely worth reading. Again, it's on the assessment sheet. And what they were doing was, in the 1960s, reacting against what had happened with the way graphic design had evolved. So if you look at, this is my argument, and we've had arguments about this, me, Bronwyn, and other people. So in my view, graphic design really comes to age and starts existing as a codified profession post-World War II through the rise of the commercial artist, where now they're actually strategically using art and artists to work in their graphic communication, graphic design space to sell product. By the time the 60s have hit, civil rights, Vietnam, stuff's going on in Europe, rise of the middle class, more educated people, there's an awareness that somehow this banality of making cat food ads over and over again, and that's what they say, cat food, stomach powders, detergent, hair restorer, striped toothpaste, aftershave lotion, before shave lotion, slimming diets, and so on and so forth. The banality of that and looking at that production in a critical way is not happening. So a bunch of leading designers get together and they say, no, we don't want that. We want something else. They're not saying, they're not taking sort of the anarchic approach. They say, we do not advocate the abolition of high-pressure consumer advertising. This is not feasible. nor do we want to take any fun out of life. But we are proposing a reversal of priorities in favor of more useful and more lasting forms of communication. We hope that our society will tire of gimmick merchants, status salesmen, and hideous persuaders, and that the prior call on our skills will be for worthwhile purposes. So they want to do something that's more interesting in the graphic design field than churning out another cat food ad. So this was signed in 1964, it was re-signed in 2000, and for some strange reason it's re-signed in 2014. All right? So it obviously hasn't happened yet. But this is another sort of example of design trying to claim a space, an ethical space, of giving you a framework or a way of thinking about what it is to be a designer in your relationship with your audience, with your community, with your society, and with the world at large, which is not captured in or codified in the code of practice. Dieter Rams, and we've spoken about this, the 10 principles of good design. Again, for him, you don't normally talk about the artifice that design can be in terms of honest, right? Brad talked about built-in obsolescence. You don't talk about long-lasting. You don't talk about environmental friendly and so on, right? So here's another one. This is another one, the Guerrilla Girls. So it's not so much so a manifesto, but it's definitely a staking of ground. So the Guerrilla Girls, do you know the Guerrilla Girls? Some of you do. You need to Google that, all right? The Guerrilla Girls guide to behaving badly, which you have to do most of the time in the world as we know it. And they're staking a claim. So when they say use the F word, they're talking about feminism. They're talking about claiming that ground aggressively and confronting. So this one at the bottom, you can see, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So they're asking the hard questions. They want you to engage with that. All right? So where does that leave us? Where does it leave you? So we've looked at ethics. All right, we know what ethics is. Ethics, quite simply, is a way of trying to understand what is good, what it means, where it comes from, what are the foundations, what is source, right? Then we talked about meta-ethics. Normative ethics is about how you judge something. Do you judge it from, I'm bound to do this, this is my job, this is my duty, I believe in human rights, I believe in equality, I believe in freedom of speech, and that's my position? Or do you do ethics usually focusing on the consequences of action? Most of the time, we do a bit of both. But all three are really useful, right? Actually questioning what good is, where it comes from, and then asking yourself, is it absolute? Is it relative? And then finally looking at applied ethics. While your industry and your discipline does provide you with a framework, as poor as it is, it does start to ask you to have those discussions and think about it. But the next thing is to move beyond that and ask yourself, not as a commercial practice, but as a person who is making meaning and engaging and having intercourse with the audience. Where do I stand? What is my belief? What will I do? What will I not do? And start asking those questions. Why do it? Because only when you can start thinking about it, only when you can start articulating those positions, can you then arrive at a situation where you are comfortable in your practice and can work from a position of strength rather than working from a position of defense. All right? Any questions?